Right, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name's Ray Johnson. I'm Joint Managing Director of Safety and Access. We work very closely with the NASC, and particularly have worked with on SG4 and TG20. And one thing which is brand new that's going to be coming out very shortly is a standard document for scaffold specifications. So more of that a little bit later. The first thing we're going to talk about very briefly is SG4. This is the NASC safety guidance note for preventing falls in scaffolding. It has been out in a number of different guises before, and there is an agreement with the HSE that this document is updated every 5 years. This document came out at the end of last year, and as far as the HSE is concerned, they have been using it since the 1st of January this year, so that if anybody isn't erecting scaffolds to this standard, the HSE will be taking action. A little bit of the background first of all. Falls from height, as I think most of you are probably aware, account for about half all fatal accidents in the construction industry. And scaffolders obviously, when erecting, altering or dismantling, are constantly faced with this hazard. The revised guidance will represent a further step change within the scaffolding industry regarding safe work at height. The industry has come a fantastic distance as far as protecting scaffolders whilst working. Since the introduction of the new style SG4 in 2000, there has been a 78% reduction in the number of reported falls involving scaffolders, and that's despite an increase in numbers of operatives of almost 20%. Now this obviously only applies to NASC members, and they very, very strictly enforce that in order to get membership, people have to demonstrate not only that their people are trained on SG4, but they are actively using it on a daily basis. This is the types of picture and this is the types of practice, unfortunately, that still takes place on unregulated sites. Now you can see here the guy, not only in his working position is exposed to a fall, but just think for a moment how he got there in the first place, and more importantly, how he's going to move to a position of safety. These are scaffolders putting sheeting on. Now I might have seen it as shown in a previous presentation here. We've seen a very big scaffold collapse in Cardiff, and one of the causes for that scaffold collapse was the scaffold was sheeted on the inside and thereby causing a big sail. I think these scaffolders have taken the advice that sheeting needs to be on the outside. Yeah, but from a place of safety, please, not in that kind of environment. Unfortunately, earlier this year, there was a fatal fall to a scaffolder. And as you can see there, a guy unfortunately fell, suffered severe head injuries. He was working with his 21-year-old son, and he only fell about 10 feet. Now, for those of you that were here earlier, Jason, who was talking about his fall many years ago, also fell 10 feet. This guy, unfortunately, didn't live to tell the tale. It was understood that he was working at this level, and he lost his balance whilst carrying a scaffold tube and toppled backwards and hit his head on the ground. So unfortunately, accidents still do happen, but I would say if that guy had been following the guidance of SG4, he more than likely would still be here with us today. SG4 is written very closely in conjunction with the work at height regulations. And all the way through SG4, which I'm only just going to cover briefly, we're looking at the hierarchy very closely. The first issue is to avoid working at height if possible. But really, when you're talking about scaffolding, somebody's already taken that decision. So the avoid working at height, and to a certain extent in using a safe place of work, have already taken away from the scaffolder. So what we need to do is provide work equipment to prevent falls and then mitigate the distance and consequences of any fall. SG4, as I say, has been around 2000, 2005, and now 2010. Just before I go through this slide, some of the changes over the years are particular is the working platform that scaffolders are actually working on. In 2000 version, it was a minimum of a 3-board wide working platform. Unfortunately, some people still think that is the case today. It isn't. That was changed in 2005 to a full boarded platform, less 1 board. And the reason why we reduced it by 1 board is at that time, the main way that we prevented scaffolders from falling is allowing them to clip onto the ledger on the inside. And obviously you needed the board to be removed so that they could gain access to that ledger. Now in 2010, just so that there is no misunderstanding at all, this is very important, scaffolders must work from a fully boarded scaffold at all times. They must work behind a single guardrail at all times. The only exceptions to those is where a risk assessment shows that it is not practicable to do it that way, in which case you can then use a harness. But to use a harness instead of scaffold boarded platform is not acceptable because the HSE's hierarchy is collective protection over personal protection. So I just thought it was important to get that point over. So going back to the slide, there has been a change since 2005. We are now talking about establishing a scaffolder's safe zone. This is somewhere where the scaffolder can work safely. He will always wear his harness and his lanyard, so he'll always have his fall arrest equipment with him. The key area we need to look at, and when we reviewed the 2005 version, is the matter of unprotected traversing at an exposed edge. In 2005, a scaffolder was allowed to walk along a scaffold no more than the distance of the material that he was fixing. So consequently, a scaffold could be 50 feet in the air, he's fixing a 21-foot tube on a boarded platform, and he's allowed to walk past the end of the guardrail for 21 feet to fix that tube. That is no longer allowed. It's now considered unsafe, and the main reason for that is because we've got new systems of work and new technology available which enables us to give guardrail protection by using proprietary fall arrest equipment. So the picture that we show there was used in a previous version of SG4 as an example of good practice. That is no longer accepted because he has not got the guardrail edge protection there, and that is what is required. Now that would be an instant prohibition notice, or more likely, with the way that the HSE are actually really getting quite hard on working at height issues, more than likely nowadays straight to prosecution. So as I've said, there has been a development over the last few years on safety technology, and this element is something now that can be managed and must be managed, and if you've got scaffolders on your site, you must not let them work unless they are working on a fully boarded platform behind a single guardrail. So the scaffolder's safe zone is where suitable edge protection and a platform exists. It can be achieved by a number of different methods, including progressive work platforms, use of powered access, and collective fall protection systems. So we're just going to have a quick look at some of those. Surprise, surprise, we've just heard of a presentation now on mutes. There is no reason why scaffolders can't use mutes in the erection of scaffolding. If you look back about 10 or 15 years on steel frame buildings, most of the edge protection, like you can see there on the left-hand picture, was actually erected by scaffolders either walking on steelwork or actually using ladders to actually gain access to put these temporary guardrail structures up. Now, 99% of all that type of structure, if it isn't already in place as part of the design, is actually put out of mutes. The picture on the right-hand side actually shows scaffolders building a slung scaffold. Now this was on a bridge that went over a river, but about 90% of the bridge was actually over a level ground. So when they did the risk assessment and looked at the job, they said, hold on a minute, why should we put scaffolders at risk working down where they can fall and we've got to consider the rescue? Why don't we get a MEWP involved and build the scaffold out of the MEWP? First thing that happened is the productivity went through the roof, the scaffolders worked much quicker, and the scaffolding company lost a fortune because they actually forgot to change the labour rates for the scaffolders. So they went away a day early and got paid quite well. So they were quite happy on that one. The next thing that you can look at is how to create the scaffolder's safe zone with proprietary system. What we're talking about is advanced guardrails. If you look on the stand outside, and you've already had a talk about it from PASMA, an advanced guardrail system can be used in aluminium towers, it can be used in system scaffolds, it can be used in tube and fitting. There's two systems there. One of them is one for the system scaffold, and there's one called JAG there, which you can use in a horizontal area. They have two systems, one for putting the first bay guardrail in, very similar to an advanced guardrail, and then when you're working horizontally, pushing out the horizontal guardrails, and it works very quickly when you've got tall structures and very long structures, very, very fast. And the scaffolders are always working from behind the protection of a guardrail. We've got a proprietary system on the left-hand side using specialised fittings to actually push a guardrail, an advanced guardrail up in front of you, mainly in use on tube and fitting scaffolds. Well, probably the one that is the default at the moment is the scaffolder's step. Now what the scaffolder's step does, it allows a step to be fitted onto the guardrail of the lift that you're actually working on, so that you are able to gain height to be able to put the next lift's guardrail in. So where his waist is, that's the lift of the scaffold, which is actually acting as his protection whilst he's on that platform. That scaffolder is actually clipped on. They are still clipped on, so they do use that because there is a very, very small chance that they can slip through the gap. Very, very small. The idea then is as the scaffolder builds his scaffold, he then puts his transoms in, he puts his scaffold boards on, he then gains the normal access because he's been bringing his ladder access up with his scaffold, so the permanent ladder access becomes a temporary ladder access for the scaffolders as well. And when he goes up onto that platform, he's on a fully boarded platform with a single guardrail protecting him, which is acceptable as far as the HSE is concerned because the scaffolder is working on building the scaffold. A couple of things to point out. You must make sure that those single guardrails are put at the end of the platforms as well, at the end of the scaffold. Very important. The other thing is some scaffolds are built now with very wide gaps between the scaffold and the building. If there is a gap more than one board wide, you need to start putting either more boards in or an internal guardrail. If the scaffold is going past a large window or door opening, you need to put internal protection to prevent the scaffolder falling there. So there are a number of issues that you need to look at. The simple way from an inspection point of view though is it a fully boarded platform? Has it got guardrails at all edges where there is a potential fall? If it's got that, the scaffolder's working in his safe zone. You can use your existing progressive platform. This is one of the areas where you've got to think about, and this is where the scaffolders need to use their harnesses. If they are on, say, for instance, a 12 lift scaffold where only the top two levels are going to be working, the scaffolder then starts to move his boards up. As soon as he removes the board from under his feet to put up onto the next level, whilst he's doing that operation, he needs to be clipped on all the time because obviously he's taken his platform away from himself and there is a risk of falling. So there is, in the guidance, the use of double lanyards may become necessary in this place because if he hasn't got his guardrail, he must be clipped on permanently all the time, which means double guardrails need to be thought about, double lanyards. Excuse me. So the minimum PPE for scaffolders will remain with their harnesses. We always advise that as soon as they get onto the site, even when they're moving materials around, that the scaffolders wear the harnesses so that there's no danger that when they get up onto the platform, they're not actually going to have them with them. You've also got to think about rescue. In my opinion, and my company's opinion, probably one of the best forms of rescue if you're doing slung scaffolds or working where a scaffold could be suspended is using, for instance, a retrievable inertia reel. Very simple, it prevents the fall. If he is exposed, if he's lost his balance, you can get him back very simply. Very, very low tech, very easy to use. So the sorts of places where scaffolders need to use their harnesses, in addition to moving the boards, is on a slung scaffold. Anywhere slung scaffold, truss out scaffold where there is a drop below him, or on open beamwork. And you can see on the sketch on top that the guy is using a double lanyard because as he's moving down the beam, he needs to clip ahead of himself, and it's like a monkey swing, so he's always got one point of contact with his harness at all times. The foreword of SG4 says it all, really. The revision represents a step change in the way the scaffolding contractors should erect their scaffolding structures. The guidance is straightforward and comprehensive and represents best practice within the industry. The HSE will no longer accept the unprotected traversing element of the tunnelling principle that featured in previous versions of the guide. So when you go back to your sites tomorrow, you need to check your risk assessments and your method statements of your scaffolders and the training to ensure that they are using the most up-to-date guidance, SG410. I'll come back to questions at the end if that's okay with people. The other thing I just want to mention very quickly is TG20 08, which is the technical guidance of BSEN 12811. It's been out, as the name suggests, since 2008, and really the guidance will impact on all scaffolding design in the UK. It's been issued as an industry technical guidance on the use of the European standard 12811, and that applies to all tube and fitting scaffolds from the most basic to the most complex structure. When TG20 was written, we wanted to write it in such a way that it reflected what the industry has known for many years, which is 5973, access and working in scaffolds and special structures in steel. This guidance has been withdrawn by the British standards for many years, and as from the beginning of this year, the 1st of January 2011, the HSE will no longer accept scaffolds built or designed to 5973. They have to be built or designed to TG20. So really, fundamentally, the principles of 5973 remain the same as far as the scaffolder is concerned. The scope, though, of TG20 is far wider than the previous guidance, and it's a process of justifying the design that has altered rather than the scaffold structure itself. TG20 requires scaffolds that are not erected to a standard configuration of basic scaffolds must have design input. Unfortunately, there's a lot of press out there at the moment that says all tube and fitting scaffolds have to have design. Yes, they do, but TG20 does most of the design for you on basic structures. It's only when you get beyond the basic structure that you need to get further design advice. So, very quick summary for TG20. As far as tube and fitting scaffolds, there are 4 load classes. You can work on one lift with the full load, one at 50% of the load for a standard platform, that's 2 kilonewtons per metre squared. The nominal lift heights are 2 metres, except 2.7 for the base lift. The inside boards are lightly loaded, and you will note now that we were allowed to have 2 inside boards without any further design, unlike 5973 that only allowed 1. The basic tie patterns are lines that tie at every lift or alternate lifts, and just very roughly they work out at approximately 4 metres by 4 metres if you were to use a square pattern. At least 50% of the ties need to be fitted to ledger brace frames. Ledger braces are on alternative pairs of standards. Where you've got a pavement lift, the first lift needs to be restrained by other means, and the face bracing needs to be on the outside of the standards, full height of the scaffold, every 6 bays, and erected over 2 bays between 2 ledger brace standards. In particular, if you go higher than 8 meters high and you're face bracing across 1 bay, you will need to start introducing plan bracing, which, believe me, we don't really want to get involved in. So as far as training is concerned, and we do training in scaffolding of scaffolders in Nottingham, we are now teaching them that face braces go across 2 bays, 2 ledger brace bays. There is a toolbox talk available on the NASC website on TG20, and probably more importantly, there is an interactive guidance available. This is a computer software, very, very clever, because what it actually does, when you put the parameters in for your scaffold, it can draw your scaffold for you within the program. You can put whatever you want on it. You can put beams in it. You can put, for instance, a fan protection. You can put sheeting on it. It will then check through, looking at the postcode, where you're going to put the scaffold. So it will check the wind loading for you, and it will actually print you a document like this that tells you, yes, your scaffold complies to TG20, or no, it doesn't comply, which is in the case here, because there is a bridge in, and what it will advise you is that you will need design advice just for the element of bridging, not necessarily the whole structure. So that is roughly a quick overview of what we're doing with TG20. The last thing that I just want to talk about very briefly is something that's not out yet but is due out very shortly. Within scaffolding, one of the biggest problems that we have is client organisations don't always understand scaffolding, and they say they have their own scaffolding specification. I've seen some of those. A lot of them say all scaffolding shall be erected to all relevant regulations and code of practice, full stop, which you can drive a wagon and horses through. What this specification is really giving you is a Word document which is the basic minimum that you should be asking your scaffolding contractors to supply. And then that is available for you on your organisation to add whatever other items you actually want to the specification. So the contents really are the regulations, codes of practice. It's got some issues in about competence of scaffolders training, scaffolders safety and PPE including SG4, the requirements for scaffold design, the minimum scaffold requirements, what to do with a scaffold handover, statutory inspections, cross-references to other NASC documents on risk assessment and method statements. There is a list of all the legislation that applies to scaffolding, also an appendix on the examples of scaffolders card, and then an example of a scaffold inspection report sheet. So everything that you really need to be able to go out and subcontract scaffolding works. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, that's all I've got to. My time's run out now. So really all that I've got to leave you with really, just think about the NASC. It's somebody that has been raising scaffolding standards for many, many years. People always thought that it was a bit of a gentleman's club really as far as scaffolding was concerned. Not so anymore. There are so many organisations out there that are now specifying as a minimum requirement that the scaffolders should be members of the NASC. Have a look on the NASC website, see what that means. One of the main things it means is that these members, including existing members, are actually audited at a minimum every 2 years, and they have to fight to get through that audit and make sure that their standards are maintained. Thank you very much for listening to me.